My name is Kereen Getten. I'm the author of If You Read This and When Life Gives You Mangoes. I was born in Jamaica and moved to England when I was 7 years old. I lived in the south of England, very small town. My father was a headmaster, so we moved around quite often. So we moved across the country. We moved to the north of England and stayed there for a while, and then we moved back to Jamaica for a few years. Then we came back to England, and so we traveled quite a lot because my dad was also a preacher. So we did a lot of missionary work. So we traveled to a lot of Caribbean islands in between that as well. And I was always into reading. As soon as I could choose my own books at maybe 8 years old, I was hooked on reading. I would get a book. I would sit in a corner of a room where I wouldn't be disturbed, or between two bookshelves where no one could find me. And I would just read for as long as adults would allow me to read. And a lot of the books that I would choose would be from my grandma, because she also lived in a house with us, and she had a lot of like Enid Blyton books. And so I'd read a lot of Faraway Tree, Famous Five, Secret Seven, and that's what really got me into writing.
When you say headmaster, I'm here in the United States, as are some of the listeners, but not all. Oh, God bless you, international listeners. But when you say headmaster, I of course think Dumbledore. What is that? Is that like a principal? What does that?
Principal. That's the word. So sometimes I know straight away that there's a different word that they say in America, and I'll change it in my head. But then, I don't always remember that you don't call your principals headmaster. So we call them headmaster or headmistress. You guys call them principals.
Gotcha. So he's got an office there in the front of the school. If you get in trouble, that's who you're going to see.
That's the one. Where they call your parent.
If you need the rejuvenative powers of Fox the Phoenix, well, that's as well. So I've heard you talk about this elsewhere. That's a big change, going from a small insulated community relatively within Jamaica, like described in your books, and then you can move to a town in England where you are the only people of color in town, right?
Yes, exactly. So where I was born in Jamaica was a small fishing town, and we lived above the town. On this hill in a even smaller community, and that's all I knew. Everybody knew each other, and that's where I get a lot of my inspiration for my books from. So then we moved to England, and there was so many things to adjust to. The weather, for one, it was freezing cold when we arrived. I'd never experienced that. It was snowing. I couldn't understand why ice was on the floor and not in the fridge. But also we were the only people of color, yes. And that was my first experience of racism, and that when you don't look like other people, they don't always accept that. And that was a really confusing time for me.
Well, I've heard you talk elsewhere about people actually stopping in the street and pointing at you and your family.
Oh yes, we had so many instances. We would walk into town, or we would just visit a neighboring town, and people would literally stop in the street and just stare at us in silence. They'd be having a conversation, the conversation would stop, we'd walk into a restaurant, the chatter would stop, and everyone would just stare at us. I remember a time when we went on a boat. There was this boat trip that we were going on the lake, and we were waiting in the line to go on the boat. And everybody on the boat was just staring at us. And this little girl, bless her, went, "Mummy, there's some dark ones coming on." And then we had to get on this boat. Now this little girl had announced it to everybody, and walk through this crowd of people who just stared at us. Yeah, it was very eye-opening and confusing time for me, because I didn't understand what the problem was. I was who I was, and I'd never been told that I was different. I'd never experienced being different. So that was quite eye-opening for a child as well.
I chuckle a little bit there, just one in recognition of unfortunately having had not that experience, obviously, but somewhat similar experiences, having been from an all-white town and then marrying an African American woman, and then coming back and meeting some of those same people. Like, oh, you're not who I thought you were. We were in a situation before, and now I see you. I know who you are now. And you chuckle a little bit because it's just so relentlessly terrible. What other reaction can you have unless you want to break down and weep or rage every time you think of it, right?
Well, yeah, exactly. I remember how I felt at the time as a child. I remember not wanting to get on that boat and feeling a little bit terrified that these people didn't seem to like me. That's how I felt at the time, and it was probably one of the worst trips I ever had. But when I tell a story as an adult, you know, I laugh when I tell it because it is just so ridiculous. You know, when you look back on it as an adult, you just you can't understand how or why people think or behave that way, and it's so crazy. It's almost humorous. That it's almost like out of those you know, those comedy films where someone just screams something in a crowd and everybody turns to look, and it was those instances. And maybe sometimes that's a coping mechanism, you know, to laugh about it. Like you said, instead of crying, you just sort of, you have to laugh and not let it affect you too deeply, or else, you know, you would just carry that forever.
Reminds me of John Smith and A Stranger in a Strange Land. Great book by Robert Heinlein. If you only read one Robert Heinlein book, and by God, given some of the ones he wrote, maybe that's probably not a bad policy. But Stranger in a Strange Land is a quality book, and he comes from Mars, and his observation of humanity is, oh, you laugh because it hurts so much. And when I read that, it cut so deep. But yes, that is what a Martian would take away from humanity here on Earth. That's how we're rolling.
Yeah, that's
up all
perfect,
of this. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I just said that's perfect. That's a perfect quote.
It's one of my favorites. So if you haven't read it, esteemed audience, it's highly recommended. After, of course, you've read all of Kereen's books and my books, get your copy of If You Could Read This, available now. Read that. But then when you get done, check out Heinlein. But I bring up all of that because I know that community is very much a focus, certainly in If You Can Read This, as well as was it where
When Life Gives You Mangoes.
Thank you. I was going to fumble it. When Life Gives You Mangoes. So I know that that's a big focus to, and I wonder how much that experience, that those two extremes of having a community and people all around you that are like you, that accept you, support you, help to raise you, and then going from that extreme to the other, how much that plays a role in shaping your interest in community.
Oh, hugely, I think. I know that when I was in Jamaica in that small community, I didn't really appreciate it until I left that community and didn't feel that and didn't have that anymore. I took that very much for granted, that I could go down the hill to my cousin and walk into their house and watch TV with them, or go down the road and play games with the neighbor across the road. That were all things that I took advantage, didn't take, gosh, my brain's just gone, didn't appreciate until I left. And I think, like, when I moved to England, I really sort of just expected that to continue, that, you know, I came over as a child. I thought that was normal. I thought that's what every community was like. And when I didn't experience that, I think I yearned for my home community even more. And I think that's why that reflects so much in my story. I think sometimes you don't appreciate where you are until it's gone, and then you almost idolize it as this perfect setting. We have this thing of sort of just remembering the good things of the past, you know, and there were negative things, of course, that happened in that community. But I think what I took away from it was that, you know, people were there for you and sorry, and supported you all the time. And I don't think I've experienced that since.
Have you been able to, I'm assuming now that you're an adult and you choose where you want to live and where you go, as much as any of us are able to choose those things. Have you been able to cultivate a community around you?
I think I've managed to, more so in the writing community, and I think that's been hugely helpful to do that. When I first started out writing, I was writing for years on my own. I was very isolated. I wasn't really aware of the writing community. I sort of just wanted to write. I loved writing and I just did it. And it wasn't until I went onto social media and started connecting with other writers and people who were going through the same thing. And, you know, they were having the same issues with coming up with ideas and editing and finding an agent and a publisher. And that was hugely helpful for me. I think like outside of the writing community, I've sort of accepted that I'm not going to find that sort of community again. Like I go back home regularly, and even that's changed now. People have moved on, they've left, they've grown up, they've married, and that community is not the same as it was when I was a child.
Wouldn't it be nice if you went back and it was like an episode of Cheers and everyone just turns and yells, Kereen?
I know. We've been waiting here for you this whole time.